So what is the relationship between gospel and culture? And I think there are three broad ways we can consider this. The first would be what I call the accommodation view. The accommodation view basically says, well, here's gospel, here's culture, and culture is not in sync with the gospel. So let's go ahead and tailor-make gospel to fit or accommodate the culture we're operating in. That's one way. The opposite extreme would be the isolation view, which says the gospel and culture, these are two separate domains, and then never the twin shall meet, right? So this is the idea that they're completely separated from one another. The gospel doesn't really have much to do with the culture. It's isolated from it, and in fact, we should protect the gospel from it. Well, there's a third way of understanding it, and that is the transformation view. And the idea here is that the gospel is meant, actually, at its best, to transform culture. Now, there are good things to say about both the accommodation view and the isolation view. Like the accommodation view, we know that the gospel is always embedded in some culture or other. The cross itself is a Roman crucifixion on which our Lord was crucified, which is a central part of the gospel. And like the isolation view, yes, there are some sense in which the gospel has eternal truths. And yet, the gospel should pervade culture where the culture needs to be remedied or rectified and critiqued. There are some truths in both views, but the transformation view, I believe, holds the best water. Consider, for example, again, the accommodation view. We actually had faced this in the liberal theology of Protestantism, where because, well, some said that there are no supernatural events, and the miracle of the resurrection is supernatural, and therefore we should get rid of the resurrection and just make it into a metaphor. Well, that's what some liberal theologians did, and said, well, it's like the way that Christ rises in our hearts and love rises in our hearts. Well, that's all the resurrection is really all about. Well, that's accommodating to the liberal culture of the day. So there are some dangers, real dangers, to be careful of on these views. Now, it reminds me of a phrase that a mentor of mine gave, where he basically says, well, the conservatives, we tend towards something like probably what I would call the isolation view, which is if you can't beat culture, you sort of leave it, right? If you can't beat them, you leave them. And so we retreat into our own subculture. At the same time, on the other side, the liberals would tend to say, look, if you can't beat them, we'll join them. And so we had our liberal seminaries joining these odd kind of metaphorical theologies. Well, really the key then is to beat them. It's to write the best chemistry textbooks, or to produce the best songs in the industry and the best art, so that others can see how good and true and beautiful the Christian worldview and the Christian world really is. Now, you don't, as Martin Luther said, you don't put a cross on every shoe you make, and that's not what a good Christian shoemaker does. You just make really good shoes. And perhaps someday in an interview, somebody will ask you what motivates your drive to excellence. Same thing at the water cooler. You don't look for that 3-minute opportunity to present the gospel and hope that everyone will be saved at your workplace. Rather, you work 40 hours of solid, excellent work at the workplace, and engage in friendships out of which your sharing of faith would naturally come. And so this is what I believe is a more biblically accurate understanding of the relationship between gospel and culture, and I hope that's helpful to those listening.